For me, I've always seen instruments as art, and I started checking it out, like buying some books on the subject and getting into it, and like, man, who really makes these things?
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I appreciate so much you tuning in. Visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on here. And I love hearing from folks. I love hearing people's stories, and I'd love it if you reached out and told me your story. And you can do that by emailing me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. And you're going to love today's story with Trevor Davis. Trevor and I met in Prague in September, and I was just fascinated by the conversations we were having there. And I wanted to get him on the podcast and explore some of these topics we were talking about. Trevor's path through the music world has been fascinating. In fact, it kind of reminds me of Rocky or one of those sports movies where the hero comes from behind and takes home the championship. It's a great tale of grit and persistence. Trevor talks about going to the Violin School of America in Salt Lake City during the day and then heading right to 7-Eleven to work the night shift, carving his scrolls behind the counter there while his wife's working at a call center. He runs out of money. He's going from coast to coast, dragging along his half-completed first bass, sleeping on the floor by his workbench, and spending every waking hour getting better at his craft. So we fast forward a few years later to 2013, where Trevor wins for that very bass, that first bass, a certificate of workmanship at the International Society of Bassists convention. And at that convention also, he was approached by Robertson's to work for them as a luthier. So how the heck did he get from point A to point B? How did he make it from the night shift at 7-Eleven to becoming a luthier at one of the top places in the world for musical instruments? And no matter who you are or what your life goals are, I know you're going to be inspired by this story. And it's just a great tale of persistence and grit and motivation. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Daddario Strings, and let you know a little bit about their Zyex strings, which are multifilament synthetic core, which gives them a colorful, gut-like tone, very rich sound. They're great for pizzicato playing. They're great for arco playing. They're used by Missy, Yuri, Slavic. We've had him on the podcast. Mark Helius, many other artists. They come in two tension options, light and medium. And I have some in the mail being sent to me right now. I can't wait to try them out on my bass. I'll play a few notes for you in the next few weeks, show you the light gauge, show you the medium gauge, play some pizzicato, play some arco. I'm really looking forward to that. And I know you're going to enjoy this conversation with Trevor Davis. Here we go. All right, we are on the line with Trevor Davis, who I had the pleasure of hanging out with for a week in Prague, and I'm just so excited to have him on the show. He's done so much in his career already, and we're just going to have so many interesting topics to dig into. Welcome to the podcast, Trevor.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, man, this is going to be great. Were you a bass player first? Was that your first instrument?
Well, I sort of forced my folks. They thought it'd be a good idea for me to play a trumpet and band and everything. And let's just say that was terrible. I mean, I love the trumpet now, but at the time, I purely hated it. So I'm one of those guys. I started on electric bass so I could sing in the punk band. So I had my brother would play guitar, and the mailman's son ended up playing drums. And he's actually still a drummer in Vegas, but we ended up going to jazz school together. But yeah, I mean, we started just so we could play punk, and then it turned into surf rock, and then it turned into going through, big old record piles and getting more and more into blues, and then eventually jazz, and sort of spiraled out of control that way.
Nice. When did you discover the upright bass?
Oh, man, upright bass. Even more embarrassing. So I got to the university, and I couldn't read music, and I spent like the first year. I was going to do either mathematics or music, and my parents' sage wisdom told me, well, wouldn't mathematics be boring? And I said, well, I guess mathematics would be boring, even though I find it fascinating. That's great advice, folks. I love that. So I ended up, I'll be a jazz performance major, and I could fake it all by ear, but I really couldn't read music. And I spent, 8 hours a day just sitting and woodshedding and practicing, and about sophomore year, I was, I could hack the big band charts, so the Nestico stuff, the easier stuff. But I didn't really pick up an upright bass until I was about 21. I got my first upright bass, and it was just a piece of junk, man. It's the worst Chinese. Like, it was so bad, I took it to the luthier, and it needed a new end pin because the end pin was just like shot. And he told me, well, this bass isn't worth an end pin. So I got a drumstick. I found like a 5B drumstick or something ridiculous, and I shoved the drumstick in the end of it. And then I was lucky enough to get a loan from a buddy of mine because I was just totally, completely, and utterly broke. And I got a K, and that was it, man. Like, I played a K for like my entire like career, getting my undergrad and everything. I had a K bass. It was a great K bass, but it was a K bass. It's not a great instrument.
There is a certain irony in what you do now, and that's great.
Yeah, not a small irony, a huge irony, because I see a K bass walking, and I'm like, oh God, what am I going to do for this thing? The one nice thing is I bought my K bass from there was a pair of guys that would work on basses in Vegas, Bob and Pete Rogan, and they had completely gone through this thing and just souped it up. And this was like, playability wise, it was a great K bass. It had a new fingerboard put on it and a proper saddle. It had been completely gone through, and that was, that setup was really the world difference. To me, I just thought it was a great bass. I didn't realize, and looking back on it, it's like, no, it was just set up properly, which is, most basses are amazing when they're set up, and when they're not set up, even the best bass is just impossible.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? That K bass thing, it's so fascinating to me. When I was in high school, I picked up a second bass, a K bass, and it was just the worst bass I think I've ever seen. Well, probably not the worst I've ever seen set up, but it rivals it, right? Like, the G string side was so low that it made this like weird twangy sound. The E string was so high I could put my fist underneath it, and I remember I kept it around just for like outdoor gigs, and I kept on thinking, do I want to set this thing up? But I just ended up selling it.
Well, the price of a setup, it is pretty cost prohibitive. What really needs to be done, and it's just the amount of time that goes into it. Chances are it needs a new board. It's got one of those old Brazil wood or whatever type of boards, rosewood or whatnot. just everything needs to be gone through. And then when you do that, it's hard to justify the cost. And I can't, when somebody comes into the shop, I can't really justify telling them, hey, you know what, you need to put $1,500, or if they need a new fingerboard, $2,000 into a bass that it's pretty much only worth its value to the player. I was lucky enough to sell mine for a good price because it played so well. But it's really kind of like beauty is in the eyes of the beholder with K basses, It depends on like what that person really wants. And the person that bought mine just he really wanted a K bass. He was a student at NYU, and he wanted to have a bass to keep on the West Coast where he's originally from.
Well, since we're talking about K basses and such briefly, anyway, I gotta ask you, as someone, an expert in this field. Okay, so there were American Standard basses, right?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that? Okay, I also remember seeing American Standard toilets, and someone told me, and I just feel like this can't be true, that they were made by the same company. Now, there's no way that's true, is it? Do you have any idea?
I sincerely hope that it is true, but I really don't have a clue. But I could believe it. It's a believable story.
Especially based on the quality of those basses. But I just love the idea of that as a business model. Here's what we're going to do.
Yamaha makes everything. They do. They produce everything. Yamaha C9 is like one of the greatest pianos ever,
That's true. That's a good point. Okay. Very interesting. Just looking at your bio, I said, you did a lot of jazz playing, and then it looks like going over to France kind of changed your trajectory. Can you maybe talk about the playing you were doing and how?
I was the guy that would take any and every gig that you could imagine that paid. I was playing 7 nights a week. It was any gig at all that I could possibly make to pay my bills in Vegas. I studied with Tom Warrington. He's a great jazz bass player. He's one of those Buddy Rich guys. So played with Freddie Hubbard. His own band. He's got Larry Kuntz and Joe LaBarbera. He's this great bass player. And and I was sitting there. I was hoping. Well, I just put in the legwork and I just take anything and everything. The jazz gigs would pay $50, and then I would make $250 playing rockabilly, And one of my most lucrative gigs was playing rockabilly, slapping the bass, and it was 6 sets a night. It was a lot of work to sit there and get up and do that 4 nights a week. And that was at this, rinky-dink casino, and it paid really well. And that was probably one of my best steady gigs that I had. But I took anything and everything freelance-wise. And then my wife, she had shifted from being a piano major to a French major and found this opportunity for us to teach English in France through the French Ministry of Education, which was fantastic. So I went over there with her. I figured, well, you know what? I can do my, when you're a kid, you think that you have these big dreams, So this is like my Sonny Rollins The Bridge moment. Like I'm going to go and just woodshed and transcribe everything and just get as many tunes into my fingers as possible. And, that's what I did. I spent the entire year doing that. And slowly but surely, I realized, man, it's really nice to spend time with my wife. And boy, it's really nice to sit there and actually like pay attention to the world around me. I kind of realized that my life just was not happening. I had started late. It was amazing that I could even become a gigging professional musician, even at my little low-level lounge bottom feeder bass player level that I was at, it was amazing I could do that and pay all my bills and, have this cool existence. But, I realized there were guys I went to school with that they were just so truly naturally talented. I was like, man, maybe I really need to look deep down inside. What am I actually good at? What am I actually passionate about? And how am I really going to, put these things together? Because, it was like everybody who had this natural talent at music, they could stomp me, even though I could sit there and intellectualize it and learn all these transcriptions. For me, it was always pocket point playing, like this really like tight pocket. That's kind of all I had going for me. I had really good pocket. It was just solid. It was all about the swing, man. It was all about putting the notes in the right spot. I could do that, but man, they were out of tune. And, I was lacking the fundamental stuff. So after going over there, I sort of realized, well, I've always been really good at art. I've always really been good at numbers. And my dad has like the fiercest guitar collection in the world. And I've been raised going in on guitar stores. And it's just, for me, I've always seen instruments as art. And I started checking it out, like buying some books on the subject and getting into it. And like, man, who really makes these things? And I'd kind of given up on that whole entire idea when I got back because, this was 2008 and the economy had the bottom of the market had fallen out. There were no gigs when I got back to the States. In spite of all my practicing, everything had like hit the fan. I figured, I'm going to go join the Navy's country band. Like they've got this band, Country Current, where they play, bluegrass and country music and whatnot. And so I go out there and I'm like, well, this will be it. I've been raised, my dad's a country guitar player. He ended up becoming a graphic illustrator after that, for his like real job. But he's on a bunch of singles and stuff back in the day. I figured, well, I don't like country, but it's in my blood. I know every darn song. I can play all these songs by memory. Like I'll go ahead and try this country band out. So I go out and I rent this bass from Bob's House of Basses, and there was a luthier there named Robbie Zev, who was like the coolest guy ever. He had his, I think he makes mandolins predominantly now, but he was the head of this band, the Zion Mountain Boys. They were all like, they had the curls and the Hasidic thing going on. It was just great. So I go, I rent the bass, I take the audition, and man, I just nailed it. I felt so good about that audition. I played so darn well. There were only two other guys, and I'm like, man, this is it. This is going to happen. And man, it did not happen. I found out, no, I didn't get the gig. That was that. And just so happened to be, I found out, I took the audition. This is bad news, man. It was my birthday. It was just horrible.
Oh.
It's like I took it. It was like, oh, this is like the worst birthday ever, But I had borrowed this bass and ended up taking it back. And then I sort of like, I remember, back when I was in France, I've been looking at all this stuff, and I got to see this luthier's workshop. And I had sort of written it off as being, oh, there's too much competition. There's no way to do this. So, I ended up hanging out with this guy, Robbie, for a bit in the shop and having a look around. He said, really, if you like upright basses, nobody wants to work on them. He's like, I don't want to work on upright basses. He's like, I want to work on violins and mandolins, and I'm working on upright basses because it's a good gig, and I like Bob. He's a good guy. So I sat there. I'm like, okay, well, maybe this could work. And, I got back home and I applied for the Violin Making School of America in Salt Lake. Well, did a little research first, but ended up ultimately applying there and got accepted. And the second they had an opening, me and my wife moved out there.
Wow. What? Cool. Well, I have so many questions. Had you been working with your hands before you got into instrument making? Was, you were into your dad and the guitar background, the graphic design background. Had you built things when you were younger?
I've done extensive drawing. I was really, really into art and drawing and all sorts of stuff like that. And then I built all sorts of things, anything from skateboard ramps to radios. I was really into, I had a bunch of like old, like when I was in high school, vintage synthesizers and reel-to-reel tape machines. And I played a lot with, all sorts of crazy, building whatever I could just based upon making crazy, weird sound music, which now I like kind of like, oh man, how was I doing that? How could I stand myself? At the time I thought I was doing really cool stuff, but just sitting there and trying to build basic circuits and, But yeah, I was building all sorts of stuff, but it was more like mad scientist building. It wasn't like craft building. It was like I didn't know what I was doing. I would just sit there and make stuff and make a lot of noise.
Well, no, but so that's fascinating. So building stuff, but just kind of like drawing, but with materials, like kind of maker style, like putting stuff together.
Yeah, just completely like craziness. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So you make this decision and you head out to Salt Lake City and you move out there. And what was that? What's it like being in that program? What does your day look like? What do your weeks look like?
Oh, it's fascinating. It's 8 to 4 every day, Monday through Friday. You get to see really fine instruments. You get to see Strads. You get to see Guarneris. You get to see all these great instruments. Literally, they stick you, here's the wood, here's some tools, there's some shop tools you can borrow. You need to eventually buy all your own tools. But they start you making 2 violins in tandem, side by side, so you can reinforce the skill sets. And you're doing the traditional Mittenwald technique, which Mittenwald's like, the traditional school in Germany. So it's the German technique. The Newark school is slightly different, and then the Cremonese school is considerably different. But the German technique's very, very accurate, and you develop a lot of hand skill. Okay. It's really designed to teach you how to use the tools, and it's all hand. Like you're planing end grain down with the block plane by hand. And, this was a new skill set for me. I was embarrassed. It was like me and one other guy, like we were like at the tail end of the class for that first like month and a half. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And there were some people that had some carpentry background and, but soon I was in a tie to like be at the top of the class, like probably like 3 months in, it was me and a guy named Alex Wilson. He's a great maker out in Salt Lake City right now. It was he and I were like battling for like first, cause I can't help it. I'm just naturally competitive. It's
that's interesting. So do you think it's that competitive nature that kind of push you forward like that, or something in your background, or cause it's cool, like coming in, I was curious about what the background of someone who goes into a luthier program is like. Are there any prerequisites for applying to a program like that? What does the application process look like?
They're pretty wide open. You had people who were highly skilled. They're going to go super far. And then you had people that were there to just kind of do it as a hobby, which is a little nerve wracking. It was a very troubling time to go to that school because, my wife, she had taken a job at a call center at Discover Card. And we figured, that'd be fine. But it was not fine. She was going through hell on this job. And I figured I could teach lessons and play some bass, and no, not in Salt Lake. You can't do that. Like there's no gigs. I mean, there's very few. I mean, I would play them when they came along. There's no students. It's just it doesn't exist. So it was pretty much like, I took a job at 7-Eleven, and I was carving scrolls. Like I would work. I'd be at the school from 8 to 4. And then I would go to 7-Eleven at 6 o'clock, and I would be at 7-Eleven from 6 until midnight, 5 nights a week, sometimes on the weekends. And I'm just carving scrolls behind the counter. And then, my days off, I'm working in my garage or the apartment or wherever, just trying to like make instruments. But it was just, we were destitute. I ran out of money. I didn't finish the school. I got through 2 years, and it was like, man, I gotta go get a real job.
Well, man, talk about high motivation for developing that skill set. Like if you moved out there and that's the situation. Yeah. I understand why you moved forward like you did.
Yeah. It's different, when you're destitute, it's just, you do everything you possibly can. You're playing by a different set of rules. And this was a kind of a crazy thing because it was kind of like, oh, well, here I'm going to go do something legitimate. And, little did I know, like when I get there, like everybody's joking about how illegitimate it is. And, there's a lot of people just going there to like party. And there were a lot of people who weren't. There were a lot of people who were very serious about it. A lot of people were just confused, didn't know which direction they wanted to go in. And I was like, well, man, I'm here because I need to make a career out of this. I need to actually get a job doing this. And it was definitely motivation, especially, when you wake up every morning with your wife at 3 a.m. so she can go work at a call center for a credit card company and tell people why they need to pay their credit card bills.
Yes.
She was not happy. It was a very, very hard time for both of us,
Yeah. Anybody listening who's worked at a job like that will totally identify. My job, I didn't work for a call center, but I did work for my summer job for many years. And every time I went back on break was working for Citibank, which is based in my hometown or one of their bases in my hometown, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I remember going to work every day and thinking, man, I know what I don't want to do with my life. And that is this.
It's a good motivating factor. It's good to learn that at a young age because, I don't begrudge anybody that does do it for a living, but boy, It's hard work. It's really, really hard work, you know.
It is. It is for sure. So you left the program, and then what was the?
Well, I did 1 month on a cruise ship of a 6-month contract, and I like lost my mind on the ship. Like I couldn't handle it. It was madness for me. So some people have the disposition for it, but I remember they would talk in these training videos about like some people just aren't designed to be living on a ship, and like man, it was me. Like I could not take it. I lost my mind on that ship. So like I got back from the ship, and a good friend of mine, Chris Jacoby, took me in his shop and let me work there for a month. And I finished violin. While I was going to school, I was making an instrument at home as well and restoring an instrument at home. So I got with Chris Jacoby. He helped me varnish it, and then I had restored this violin, an old violin. It was a copy of a Maggini, and I pressed the arch on it and done pretty much I scroll graphed, new blocks, every repair you could possibly do. So I was able to walk into my interview at Colstein's, and I was also going to interview at Gage the same week, but Irene hit, and that was that. I only got the interview at Colstein's. The LIRR was shut down. And I was able to fly out to Colstein's, and I had this violin I had made and finished, and one I had completely restored, and I did a bench test, and the bench test was, crazy. It's a very old school way of doing it. Here's a violin, set it up. Now, when you're a student, you set up violins, it takes you all day or 2 days to set up your first violins, So I go into this bench test, and I'm like a little intimidated. And I got the thing set up in 4 hours, and that's like a record time for me. I'm like, this is amazing. And he's like, oh, it's very good. It's it's a nice setup. It looks nice. That's good work. So he hands me another fiddle. It says, let's see if you can't get your time a little faster. And then I had to do it all over again. I thought I was done with the bench test, and I did the second one in like 2 hours. And then it occurred to me, okay, this is what it's all about. And then I was lucky enough. I got the job working with Barry Colstein, and it didn't last long. I couldn't afford to move my wife out with me. That was really hard. She stayed back in Salt Lake, and I was in Long Island. So I was only there for, I don't know, maybe 6 months. But it was intense, man. I learned a lot. It was about between 10 or 20 instruments in the morning. I would set up violins, and these were going all over the country, production instruments. And then in the afternoons, I would sit there and get to do some bass repair and some bass restoration and learn how to do, I did a scroll graph there, a new bass bar. Got to do some of that stuff. Got to do some working on white instruments that Barry had made back in the 70s that had sort of just been shelved, which is great. I mean, doing white work is super fun. And then, at home, I bought a workbench. I had like one room in a 3-bedroom house that I shared, between 3 guys. And I had a big German workbench in there. And I slept on the floor, and I sat there and I made violins every day, man. That's like, I finished 2 violins while I was working it, outside. That's what I would do at home, before I got a call from Lemur to go to the West Coast. And when you get a call from San Juan Capistrano, which is right next to Dana Point, California, I mean, literally 2 miles from the beach, and you get a call in January, you're alone, and they're right at the beach in California. Your judgment's a little clouded. And so, of course, I flew out, and they paid to move me and my wife out. So I'm very grateful for that. They were very kind, and it was great to be able to live with my wife again. What a great idea.
Yeah, no kidding. I understand that the call of California, I went out there to visit to see if we were going to move to San Francisco or not, and it was February. So coming from Chicago in February, I think it was maybe 5 degrees Fahrenheit out when we left Chicago. Get here, it's 69 and sunny. And
well, I drove trying to beat this blizzard across. I made it from Long Island to Salt Lake in 3 days, beating this blizzard. And I hit the blizzard finally in Cheyenne. It was or not blizzard, but big snowstorm. And I just followed a pair of truck taillights all the way into Salt Lake. It was pretty scary. And then I remember it was 2 days later. I had got my apartment in Laguna Niguel, 3 miles from just right on Golden Lantern, 3 miles from the beach. And I'm just sitting in the hot tub, and it's like 70 degrees out. Oh man, I wonder if I made the right decision.
Yeah, that's kind of a no-brainer.
But it was hard though, because Barry's shop was amazing. Like at lunchtime, I would play Scott LaFaro's bass, and he had Percy Heath's bass in there, and all this huge collection of awesome Prescotts and all sorts of nice old Italian stuff. And going to Lemur was definitely more of a modest, not just a catalog shop, but I mean it was definitely aimed at a completely different clientele, and it was a bit of a jumping in ice cold water, because it was a different gig altogether. But the nice thing was I was able to work on basses all day, and they really did nurture me doing top quality work, and they would let me spend all the time I wanted to spend on doing stuff. So I would go in, we would get customers in, and there's a very famous restoration book by Hans Weissar It's kind of like the Bible of restoration. And, well, it was a trip. I was there for like 1 month, and the other luthier just quit. It was just me. I was on my own, and it was just me and my training and the Weissar book. And I literally worked through the entire Weissar book and started my first bass there. And I almost finished my first bass there. I ended up finishing it when I ended up going to Lisa's shop. But working through the Weissar book and doing all those like classical restorations on basses, and I was essentially over repairing basses, but I caught up the shop. There was no backlog, and it made the customers really happy. They did really exceptional work on basses that totally didn't deserve it. They got a hell of a deal there. You know? Of course, they would have probably been a little scared if they'd have known this. Well, this is my first time ever doing this, but they turned out really nice. It was good restoration work, and I'd done it on violins before, but I had never done it on the bass, and I kind of had to teach myself. It was like, out of the furnace and into the fire for sure.
Well, what a good experience to be able to have all that time on basses like that. I'd love to know a couple things, because maybe for folks who aren't super familiar with just the luthier world, like you were talking about violin setups and taking 4 hours to put together everything. Can you what are the steps involved in that?
Well, now it's kind of like silly. I look back on that. I'm like, oh man, I had 4 hours, and then I was doing 20 in the morning, like a month later. But you got to shape all the pegs. Now, a professional quality setup does take about a half a day, on a good violin. Some shops will do a day. You have to dress the fingerboard, make sure everything's dimensionally right, carve a nut, make sure that it's the string heights are perfect. You have to shape all the pegs. The pegs need to fit perfectly because it's just tension that's holding them. So it's essentially how well each side fits. It's a cone inside of a cone. And that's what holds a friction peg in place. Basses used to have them back in the day. And then you need to carve a bridge. The bridge needs to fit the belly perfectly. The dimensions of the kidneys and the heart need to be right. The legs need to be right. And then you need to make sure that your after length of your tail gut or the after length on your tailpiece is dead on right. And then as being a bass player, you have to make sure you put a chin rest on it. I cannot tell you how many times, I'll do a batch. Because even now we'll do big APS orders for the school district, and I'll set up last spring I did about 180 instruments for the school district out here, just because we needed to get them done, and it's a good order to do. So all the time I'm forgetting chin rests, like left and right. I forget the chin rests. I think now I'm pretty good about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if I forgot one.
Well, that's something I love in Michigan. We could dig into. I'd love to dig into the experience of working at Robertson's in just a sec. But I love, my wife's from Albuquerque and played in the Albuquerque Youth Symphony, and it's funny because Robertson's has this international reputation as like this big, where you go for basses. And so I remember talking to her and being like, it's Robertson's, did you ever go to Robertson's? Like, oh yeah, they're the people that like gave us our Youth Symphony folders. That like, in people who haven't spent a lot of time in Albuquerque might not realize, like, in addition to being this famed bass shop, it's like where you go for everything in Albuquerque. Get your school instrument, get your rosin, get your sheet music and everything.
Oh, absolutely. There are people that have started on a rental instrument and stepped up all the way to like buying like a nice high quality Violin violin down the line. There are people that have started here. We really service all of Texas, Arizona, Colorado. Maybe not. There's other shops as well. But our clientele's around the country. Like 10% of our business is local, and 90% is from all over the United States. And it's crazy because it started in Don's garage. I think it was 45 years ago or 43 years ago, something like that. Started in his garage. He was a full-time music teacher. He played in the orchestra out here. He gave lessons on the side. And then he was also fixing everybody's instruments, and did that for 6 years until finally, like he decided, well, I'm just going to open up the shop. But, he's a great player and one of the hardest workers I've ever met. If there's anybody I could say, might be a harder worker than me, it's probably Don Robertson. And, he's got me beat because he's been doing it for, 45 years. It's easy to work this hard when, you're 33. It's another thing. And I've been at this shop almost 4 years now. It's another thing to be like Don, and I've done it for like decades. And he started it out of his garage, and slowly but surely, it started by just doing high quality work on student instruments, well, all sorts of instruments, but, treating the student as good as you would treat any professional player, and making sure, because a student's really starting behind the eight ball if their instrument's not even set up right. So doing really, really good work on these instruments, and then just building up by putting the money back in the business, not taking, the extravagant vacations and stuff like that, but instead really being focused on what his priority is. His priority is, this shop and the players and the students. And it's really an honor to be at the shop. It's an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, man.
I see all the fine stuff. They really specialize in the finest investment quality instruments. I've seen him pass on stuff that, like, oh my God, I wish we had it in the shop. But it has to be, condition has to be perfect. You're talking Strads and Guarneris and Testoris and Montagnanas and all sorts of it's like a dream upstairs. I walk in and I see all these instruments and I can just hold them and see them, and then I can see my instrument on the shelf next to these.
Yeah,
like what can I hang? It's like, oh my God, it's like sitting there and getting to just sit in with the Miles band whenever you have a chance, like, oh man, this is where the real pinnacle of the craft is, and it's just amazing.
Well, yeah, as a maker, just being able to be around instruments like that and being in a place where just that's the kind of quality that's moving through there, that's just got to be so satisfying. How did you end up, because we were talking when you were with Lisa, LA Bassworks, right? And how did you?
I got to Lisa at LA Bassworks. She was nice enough to make a spot for me. It was kind of like, it was really, really packed in there. And I was at a point where I needed more growth. I'd worked through the whole Weissar book on my own, and I really needed to be in an environment where I had a mentor. And I would still call Lisa a mentor. She was fantastic at that. She really cares deeply. She's a great person. I ended up having to build this huge rack up in her attic of her shop because it's super packed in there anyways. And I built this rack, and it holds like 20 basses. It's great. So we were able to clear up some space, and then I had to build the bench for myself, and then I could work there. And that was that. So I started just sweeping the floors. I would come in when I was working at Lemur, and I would spend my weekends sweeping, cleaning, doing whatever I could just to sort of hang out and get my foot in the door, and it worked. And man, she was just an unbelievable mentor. She had me on, and then I had finished my first bass. It took me about 2 years to make. Finished my first bass, and I took it to the ISB Makers Competition. That was in Rochester, and it got a certificate of workmanship, and it was fantastic. And at that point, I was approached by Don and Aaron. They wanted to know if I wanted to perhaps be interested in working there. They didn't want to step on anybody's toes, so I went back and I talked with Lisa about it. And she was really kind enough to say, really, this is what you need. Like, this is the opportunity of a lifetime, and you're the right age for it. Go do that. It sucks. I really don't want to lose you, but in keeping my best interest in mind, she was selfless enough to really hit me up to like, this is just the best opportunity anybody could ever have, and I have her to thank for it too. She really was selfless and did the right thing.
Man, how cool to get that certificate of workmanship at Rochester. That must have felt so great to get
it was
that.
Awesome. Yeah, it was like my first bass, and it it was great. And the being able to talk with the judges, Paul Hart, David Wiebe, and Dan Hadges were judges at the time. Being able to talk with them about the bass was just fantastic because all of the stuff that I had tried to do was coming through, and then the shortcomings that I were aware of, they had no problem pointing those out to me either. And it just opened my eyes so much. And then it was I think that August, I started the shop.
So you're working on it for 2 years.
2 years. I dragged it from Salt Lake to New York to the West Coast. And, in the mornings at Lemur, I would sit there and, I like to ride my bike a lot. And that's a beautiful bike ride down to the shop there through a bunch of orange groves, or you can go the other route that goes right by the ocean. So I'd get up about 5 a.m. and ride my bike to the shop, get there first thing in the morning, and just make until they opened. I think they opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was great, and I did that just about every day of the week. And then I had Mondays off as well, and I think I was there on Mondays. And it was just a knockdown drag out. It was so hard because I had no direction. How do you make one of these things? It is, being a violin maker, I think it even made it more difficult because it's so none of those skills, but you want to be as precise as you are with the violin. And then when you make a bass, you need to understand how to scale it up, and scaling it up is complicated. It's very complicated and exhausting.
Because I know the shape is I know it's starting to kind of codify. We're starting to get a similar string length for basses, but still, it's got to be such of a kind of like blurry art, maybe compared to the art of violin making that's gone on. How?
Well, it's funny. I thought that for a while, and I'd say working in this shop, and right now, I think we're up over 60 basses in our inventory, And I'm really starting to see, like, the trends are coming together. The numbers are there. Everybody's starting to do the same thing now. And you are starting to see, after years and years and years or centuries of it being all over the map, like, there's a lot of standard numbers now. And it's good to see, because it's making players better. It's going to help the player in the long run, and it's going to help the maker in the long run too, because, I mean, I didn't know, like, my first bass, I had to carve 2 scrolls for it, because the first scroll I carved had an E flat neck. And I was like, well, I could graft this, but then I was looking at the work on the scroll. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to give that to Mom, and I'm going to carve a better scroll with a D neck, My mom still has it.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we were talking about that, I think, in Prague a little. I remember how things have started to become standardized with bass and violin. I mean, it used to be non-standardized with violin too, right? And it kind of...
I mean, it was more obviously more standard than the bass, but I mean, yeah, it wasn't until the Violin Shop they started ripping the necks out of old Strats. They were nailed in originally. They pull them out, they cut this mortise, they shove the neck in, they change the angle. Now we have steel strings. I mean, there was a lot of modification and a lot of numbers that did become standardized, and in the past weren't standardized. So I think what you're looking at with old instruments is not an old. I mean, you are looking at an old instrument. You're looking at an evolution of centuries of. It's been informed through the centuries of playing, and virtuosity that's come. The bow has changed shape dramatically, especially with bass, but across the board, the shape of a standard bow is completely evolved, and what you're seeing is this lineage of this progression of the instrument. So it's not quite as cut and dry as it's like, oh well, the old instruments were they were masterfully made, but they needed to be modified to be playable by modern standards, because the standards of virtuosity are, I mean, you look at playing from 50 years ago by the greats and the playing by the greats now. I mean, everything has just gotten better and better and better, and making wise too. I mean, I would argue that the modern maker has they have to make up for all these things that old instruments are. They get an excuse, they get a pass on. Old instruments aren't necessarily even across all registers. They might have a great low end, and then in the upper register they're not so much. So one gets called an orchestral bass, one gets called a solo bass. Well, as a new bass maker, like, that doesn't fly. You can't just tell people, well, just don't play up there. Or, I know it sounds great up there, but, like the lower end, it's, you have to sit there and find a compromise between all these things, because you're working with physical elements and a limited body of information. I mean, you have to sit there and come to these conclusions yourself, because it was so secretive in this industry for so long. And when you get to the, kind of like the top of the heap in the big shop, you realize, like, wow, no, this really does come down to how well you as a human being understand the art and what goes into the instrument, what makes a good instrument. And it's, it's being able to compare all the fine old basses, and you see that there are shortcomings, even in like the $1 million instruments out there. There's still shortcomings. And as a modern maker, you need to remedy those and find a way to make an instrument that can hang in an orchestra next to the $1 million stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what are some of those numbers that have kind of begun to standardize or standardize, like just in terms of string length and that kind of thing?
Oh, sure. I'd say a 41.5-inch string length. That's, that's standard. Your projection, your bridge height, so you can put a normal bridge on it. I mean, that's been standardized. Your overstand on top of the body. I mean, it's still a range, but I see most modern makers making it between 30 and 40 millimeters. The distance of where the bottom of the neck mortise is to where the bridge sits really affects where your half string is, where your harmonic. And, getting that short enough so that you can reach the G, and being able to reach the G, being able to have a D neck. I mean, very few E necks. I mean, almost every E neck that comes in the shop is being converted nowadays. I don't see E necks really being around much longer. And, being able to grab the F on the G string, without bumping into the shoulder too much. And I wish there was more of a number for that, but I mean, there is. I mean, that mensure length that I was talking about, that distance between the mortise and the bridge. But I mean, these things are becoming standardized, and the break angle of the strings over the bridge. You're not seeing as many high saddles anymore. High saddles are very important on certain instruments, but it's not the cure-all that I think for a bit there, everybody was getting a high saddle put on everything, and it's just not the cure-all that people want.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that was like such a big thing when I was in college. It's like, oh, I got to get this set. Like, why did people do that, or what possible benefit does that have?
If you have an old instrument, you're going to take some tension off of the top, but part of that tension is being removed from the top when you sit there and have a slightly higher overstand. It gets technical quick, but you get a lot of old tops collapsing, but a lot of it's the result of bad repair work. But then the other part is you have steel strings now as opposed to gut strings, so there's a lot more tension on the top of the instrument. And some instruments, respond a lot better to that. I think a lot of this stuff can be fixed with arch correction and a proper bass bar, but that's more expensive. And sometimes you can fix some of these things with a high saddle. And sometimes a high saddle is just absolutely super important. So I can't, I don't want to minimize the importance of it. It's a great tool to have in the bag. But, and I guess most people, you're never going to know if it really helps your bass or not until you get one. But I'm not usually recommending them unless I see something that says, well, this top is in serious danger.
What is an arch correction? That sounds very intense.
It's super intense. It can get scary real quick. Pouring plaster casts and doing full arch corrections. It's very commonplace in the violin world. In the bass world, not so much, because sometimes with an old top you end up having extensive doubling, and you would need to pull out all that doubling. Pulling out a ton of doubling can get dangerous real fast. And, sometimes, like the traditional old German doubling, they would get down to a millimeter thick and only leave 1 millimeter's worth of wood. Once that's been done to a bass, it's kind of tragic. I don't know if you could really, I'm sure somebody could, and they'll correct me, and I'm sure you'll hear about it, but I'm sure you could pull that out, but you're getting into real scary territory. And at that point you have to wonder, well, how much of that, what is the integrity of the original maker's intentions anyways? It's a balancing act between all of that. But typically you'll see dipping in around the bass bar from poor bass bar fitting. And if you can, and sometimes you can pull some of that out. And, well, I should say, with an infinite amount of resources and time, you can do anything. And that's a fact. The other fact, though, is that the player doesn't have infinite resources and does not have infinite time. So you're always trying to find this nice balance where okay, well, can we have the bass for a few months or a half a year, and what their budget is, and trying to do repairs with the most amount of integrity as possible. It's tricky. It's a balancing act constantly. And I would prefer the more hands-off approach, just so long as you can undo it down the line and get the customer out there playing. You kind of need to serve the customer and serve the instrument, and the original maker's intentions all at the same time. I wouldn't alter a fine old instrument, at the request of a player if it was in any way going to harm the integrity of the instrument.
Okay. Yeah.
I know it's a
no. But that's important. I think Scott Pingle, I don't know how well you know Scott or if you know him at all, but he was talking about how with these older instruments, he had this great quote. I'll have to look it up, but it was we're just a part of the journey of these instruments, which is a beautiful thing to think about. If you think about the hundreds of years that these have been around, and there are instruments, but they're not, in a sense, too. They're a piece of history.
Well, it'd be like trying to fix the smile on the Mona Lisa, I mean, seriously, you get some heavy-handed repair work and it can go south real fast, and you see it. And a lot of that happened around the turn of the century. A lot of heavy-handed repair work, especially as these instruments were first getting imported in the United States, and they were, the values started climbing. As soon as the value started climbing, all of a sudden, any old thing out there was being whipped into shape, and we lost a lot of fine instruments that way.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to know what you're restoring these instruments, but then you're also making instruments. And I've got a ton of questions about all of this, but what is a day in the life like for you now, or a week in the life in terms of making your own instruments, restoring? How does that look for you?
There's a lot of lists involved. I always have lists of everything I'm working on in progress, and sub lists of those, of the steps that I want to get done and kind of the order of operations. And every time I have a project come in, I want to think about, what order do I want to tackle this in, and how much drying time am I going to give this? The more drying time, the better. But also the player needs to get his instrument back. So you're always walking this fine line. So making sure that if something doesn't have much tension, giving it, a good 4 hours of drying time's fine. If there's a lot of tension on it, letting it sit overnight. Yeah, sometimes there's tension in it just because that crack is just wide open and you have to press the crack back. I'm not talking about forcing anything. I'm talking about sitting there and putting it back where it wants to go. But that being said, so I'll hit the bench at like typically 7 in the morning, and I'll glue a crack on something, maybe a couple different things, and put it aside, and then pull out whatever I'm making and work on that. Or I'll pull out if there's like some setup work that comes in. I try to get setup work done just about as fast as it comes in the door. I try to get it turned around. That way the player gets their instrument back, and then I don't have to sit there and have one extra thing to think about. I try to work as efficiently as possible. But I have lists on the making that I want to do, and I always have little projections of like what I want to get done that week. I take a lot of time to think about it. Whenever I'm walking my dog, whenever I'm out on a hike or whatever, I like to think about, well, what's feasible, what order am I going to do these things in, and where am I going to give myself the cushion? Like I need to give myself some cushion room as well if I want to get these things done. Like for making, it's always like I try to give myself an extra 2 days at the end of all of it to scrape it and just scrape like mad, and it's a very tedious process. Same with the restorations, the touch up, sometimes you'll spend as much time doing touch up as you do spend in the actual hard body, repairs. And it's important. It's very important. It seals the cracks on the outside. You want to make sure that obviously they're glued well, but you want to slow how much humidity can get in there. And it also looks a lot better. Let's face it. I mean, like you want to make that crack disappear. And yeah, it's not always possible. That's why I try not to be too judgmental of work that I see, because you never know the circumstances of any repair job. Optimally, you want to be able to touch it up. You want that touch up to just look fantastic, not be invasive.
Oh, yeah, sure. Something that one of the things I think Robertson's, the shop is well known for is just setup work. I'm sure it's really different depending on the bass or the player, what they want, but what are some of the components that or some of the variables in a setup that you work with? Someone sends in a bass. What are some of the most common things that you do?
I'd say a lot of it is, I like to, if at all possible, I want to make sure that there's enough of a board there. When the board starts getting really, really thin, it just starts going south fast. I mean, it moves more. It's more susceptible to warpage. The ebony that you can get now compared to the ebony you used to be able to get, it's just inferior. And that's just across the board. We're buying the top quality stuff, and you can see that it's not as nice as the old German stuff that we used to get. Even though none of it actually came from Germany, it was sold through Germany. Right. I mean, it's like you don't have ebony trees growing in Germany. But being able to make sure that the board's nice and solid. Next is making sure the camber in the board is appropriate. Making sure the length of the board's right too. I mean, sometimes you get, like the solo extensions. That's a nice thing to have. But sometimes, the length of the board is just like crazy long, and that can make things wolf. That can make things just sort of out of whack. Making sure that the camber's dead on. Then making sure that the arch of your board meets the arch of the bridge, and that's like so integral to being able for string crossing, for just being comfortable. And I think having our adjusters put in, it's a nice thing. I mean, Don sort of developed these, adjusters way back when. I mean, everybody's seen them, the big black adjusters. They turn nicely. There are people that say, oh, well, you lose some tone. If anything, we found that, it might darken things up slightly. They work. I for the most part, I like the sound of the basses with the adjusters in. I don't find enough of a significant difference. I mean, you can sit there and put it into a program and probably find that there's, some missing upper partial. But at the end of the day, I feel like traveling with the bass, it's really nice to have those adjusters in there and, to be able to control it. And then making sure that the bridge is the right size for the top and for where the bass bar has been put. And unfortunately, not much control of where the bass bar has been put. You can replace that, but I mean, most players aren't going to just sit there and have you pop the top and fix that. I would say that you can drastically make a bass sound better by putting a new bass bar in and making sure that it's the appropriate size and dimensions and orientation geometrically to the bass top. And there's a lot of people that have not been doing that over the years, and there's a lot of really ugly, bad bass bars and basses, and it really does dramatically affect the tone of a bass. That's one of the few ones, I think sound post adjustment can really adjust the feel of the bass, and your sound post, it just definitely needs to fit. That's the other thing. Sound posts, whenever you take a bass into a shop, just be planning on getting a sound post done, because it's just so important to the life of your bass and the health of it. I mean, the health of the instruments. I mean, we try to keep it cheap, but I mean, it's super important. The last thing you want to do is have too short of a post in your bass. It's not gonna work as well, and it's dangerous for your instrument. And then you also don't want to have too tight of a post either. But out when you come out to the desert, we'll let you know real quick if that's a problem. We'll get it the hell out of there because it's that's an issue too. But that's less of an in the desert. We fit something out here. Typically, we can put it in there with a little more tension because whenever we go to if it's going to a more humid climate, it's your bass is just going to swell up like a tick.
Yeah. Well, I love those bridge adjusters. Those are actually the ones that I have in my bass. And I mean, just functionally, in terms of practicality, it's just such a kind of a no-brainer thing to have.
Yeah, they're really nice. And I mean, I know it sounds silly, but it's like to have them installed properly, it's a world of difference whenever you're traveling,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the fingerboard and making sure, and in terms of wolfing, have it, that solo extension can sometimes have an effect. What are some other, and wolves can be such a frustrating thing, right?
Honestly, like I'd say dig back in the archive and, like Schnitzer really hit the nail on that.
Yeah.
They're the bane of our existence. It is a nightmare. So I had two basses that I was messing around with that I had made, and I decided, because it's the cavity resonance of the bass. The Helmholtz resonance is the air resonance of the bass. If you blow over the side of the F hole, kind of like a bottle, and you have to have quite a bit of breath, and you can do it. You can get it. You can get a tone out of it, and it directly correlates with Wolf's. And so the thing is. So I tried to tune one, and the way I did it is I pulled the back off of two basses that I had made, which is intense beyond belief.
Yeah,
that was like crazy. I think, when Don and Aaron came in the next day, I had these two like rib garlands that were just essentially 10 centimeters thick, but it was the entire rib with blocks of a bass. They're actually hanging on the wall, they're right over there, and they were like, "What the hell are these?" And I took a handsaw and I cut a centimeter off the rib depth of both of the basses to test my theory. And I did it with both of them. And this is science, man. When you sit there and you actually just do this, you pull the back off, and I cut it off with a handsaw. And sure enough, I was able to push that Helmholtz resonance around by shortening and by making it a little more shallow. I was able to raise the pitch a little bit. And, one of the basses, when it's in tune, that note is just flipping amazing. It's the biggest note on the bass. And guess what? It still stands out like mad. But there's no wolf. Note is now just louder, and it's just the natural physics of the instrument. I mean, if it's vibrating, there's going to be a wolf there, and trust me, like that is like after doing that experiment, I'm just like certain. I'm like, you can do a lot with the wolf eliminators and stuff like that, but I mean, it's a part of the instrument, and you need to find a way for you as a player to be comfortable in your playing whenever you play that note, because it's just there's no way. It's going to be a part of that instrument. It's going to be a part of instruments. I've made instruments on the same exact mold, out of the same exact wood, out of the same exact logs, and I have had one instrument with a wolf and one without. Same arching, same thicknesses. It is just, it's like a ghost in the machine. So it's as many times as you can come up with some correlation to sit there and come up with some silver bullet to get rid of them, by all means, I think people should do as much research as they possibly can, and then they should share it with me. Because, I'm paying as much attention as I can to what's going on out there. And from what I can tell, like, there is no, it's a part of actual instruments. And then old basses, they're Wolf City. I mean, I've worked on many, many old instruments just sitting there eliminating wolves. And, we can do it with weights in the top and whatnot, and tail gut, and you can do all sorts of things. Arnold talked about it at length. And everything he said is dead on right. I mean, it's the technique that everybody uses, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think he used the term black art for it.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, I mean, you want to get some smudge sticks out or whatever, like just about, you want to hold a seance or something. I mean, I'm okay with that. Maybe that would work. If it goes away, man, I might be all right with it.
Well, so you're a bass player and you're making basses, and I think it's really interesting that you're not just making basses. You're making violins, you're making violas, you're making cellos. As a maker, what do you find interesting about making the other instruments besides basses? What's satisfying about making the violins, violas, and cellos?
I think it's really I get to see I'll hold a really beautiful instrument. Say we'll have a couple customers come in regularly with their Go Frillers or their Strats and all, and you hold it and you see it and you're like, man, I I've got to take a stab at that. I've got to try this out. I've got to, and I feel like it's different. The structure of wood is a fixed thing. I mean, the grain structure is only so big, and when you go to like smaller instruments, it's way more finicky. I mean, you plane some wood too hard, and you get a 1 millimeter divot in a bass. Well, you can adjust the arch and make that go away if you had some super flame stuff. You do that in a violin, and you've destroyed your arch. So it's a more refined art. There's less room for error. With a bass, your problems are really on a much more grandiose scale, like setting a neck straight, dead centered on a bass. The smallest millimeter change in the neck mortise, and your neck's crooked. I mean, it's a completely different set of challenges making a bass. When you make a violin, getting your neck set straight. The mortise is one of the easy parts of the violin. The harder parts of the violin is like, well, how good can you carve? I mean, it really tests your skills and patience. You carve something that's beautiful and accurate, and for me, I'm about I think everything should be informed by the traditional stuff. I don't necessarily think you need to make recreations of classical instruments, but I feel like it should look like a classical instrument. It should be informed stylistically that way. Whenever you're looking at violins and cellos and all, there's just much better, much higher quality stuff. I feel like the bass is it wasn't necessarily a standardized instrument. So, the great makers didn't make those instruments. Not until you got to Venice, where in the Venetians, they really started the tradition of, great bass making. And then the English after that, But the early Cremonese basses were just all over the map and beautiful. Same with the Brescian. Beautiful, gorgeous, but all over the map, dimensionally, in every which way.
I wonder why that was. Was it just somebody in a workshop got inspired to make a bass, or was it like the black sheep of the workshop was like the bass guy?
I think it was all commissions. And I think a lot of it came down to there were already a bunch of gamba makers, and the gambas were more expensive at the time. The tradition were really that's what all the royalty had were, and people, nobility, were playing gamba. And the violin was kind of like the electric guitar of the era. And it sort of came on, and it didn't have frets or anything, and it wasn't intonated, and it was kind of played on its own. It wasn't necessarily played in ensembles. I think not until you got to the early Verdi stuff did they really start having ensembles playing those instruments. But I mean, so because of that, there were already a lot of gambas sitting around and a lot of violones sitting around. So there wasn't much of a need. Now, who made those? Well, that's a whole different tradition. You got to see some of it in Prague. You saw those 5-string, the Viennese instruments, It's very separate to the violin. Now, the Paul Brun book, he's stating that the oldest instruments that he's found, there were violin basses. And it was a violin family instrument with round back and violin corners and everything like that. I mean, I feel like you're chasing your tail to sit there. It's like chicken or egg. There was a need for it. They started making them, and I'm pretty sure that they had customers coming into the shop with money and that they were willing to spend that money on that instrument. And they said, well, I'm willing to make that instrument. If somebody asked me to make a gamba, I mean, I'd ask for all the money up front first. But boy, I'd make a gamba in a heartbeat. I'd love to make a gamba. That'd be so fun,
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure making these different instruments, like you were saying with the violins and the it's got to inform your craftsmanship just in general on the basses. And okay, so you made that first bass, and it took you 2 years. And then how many basses have you made now?
I just finished 14.
Okay, 14. How has the bass making process evolved for you? Are you making are the shapes of the basses you're making different bass by bass, or have you kind of codified one? What's changed over those?
I've come up with a mold system that just works really great for me. That it helps me maintain the loose feel of the Italian instruments that I see, while still holding onto the outline, which is super important. Now, I'm lucky enough, I get to work on and see the finest basses in the world. So I've made copies of them. And I'll go through with tramble points and dividers and everything, and I'll make a more symmetrical mold and a more symmetrical design, and I'll lay them out, because I think a lot of them were either built off the back or just bending these large pieces of wood. I mean, back in the day, they didn't have an electric bending iron. They just stuck an iron in a fire and they bent over that hot. And, bending ribs is difficult. I mean, it's very difficult. Bending bass ribs is very, very hard. Some people will build these inside and outside mold contraptions, and and they work great. You can always tell when they've been used. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just aesthetically, you lose that hand-hewn feel. And I'm not trying to necessarily make an old bass, but I'm trying to make a bass that is informed by the craftsmanship of before, while still using some mechanical advantages. So sitting there and being able to control my outline that way is great, and then being able to see these old instruments and see how they were made and what about it makes it great.
Well, that's one of the cool things about being in a place like where you're at. Just having that high quality, top, best instruments in the world coming through and being able to kind of analyze them.
Unbelievable. I mean, many of the basses from the major books that have been written end up on my bench or on David's bench. And, we like Don does a lot of work too. Like the three of us will sort of get together. I'll do a lot of the body work. David will do a lot because he does all the chromatic C extensions. He'll do a lot of the neck work. I mean, there's a lot of overlay between all of it. But then Don will be involved as well. I mean, he's sort of the voice of reason and wisdom. He's seen everything at this point. And then his son Justin is also, does all the major violin restoration here, and he's unbelievable with touch up. And sometimes it'll just be a project where it's like, man, we just need to put all four of us on it. And then being able to adjust instruments with Aaron. But yeah, seeing these fine old instruments, it really changes it. You understand what about it is fine, and you understand what about it can be improved upon. And that's not necessarily the case with violins. The violins, there's not much room for improvement. I feel like, there are a few instruments out there that are perfect violins. I mean, if somebody else has done it, you can do it too. You can sit there and look at something objectively and clearly, I guess objectively for yourself. So I guess that's subjectivity. But I mean, sit there and look at it, and you can improve upon these things and be a part of this tradition and make an instrument that lasts for centuries. You use the top quality materials, and you take every instrument seriously, and then also being able to have a player of Aaron's quality. Aaron Robertson went to Curtis and subbed with Philly quite a bit, and he's just top-notch player, top-notch person. We go in the recital hall. I mean, we have a full recital hall here too that seats I think about 150 people. Being able to take a fine instrument onto the stage. Like when I just finished two instruments in tandem side by side. I took both those instruments, and then I took, I was hard on myself. We have a really nice old bass, I won't say what it is, but a really, really nice old Italian bass. And I took that in the hall also. And we played them all side by side. And, it's kind of like a kick in the pants a little bit, because you just see that, there are some things that your modern instrument has an edge on the old one, evenness, stuff like that. But as far as just full on, epic tone, just where the old one is good, it is epically good. It is just jaw-dropping and, blows you away. And we did it sort of like a blind test with our back. We played for each other so we could, pick out which one. And, Aaron's like, does it sound better? I'm like, yeah, it definitely sounds better. He's like, well, it better. Definitely supposed to,
Yeah, that's the thing. But that's the beauty. I mean, to me, from my perspective, the modern makers, like the instruments you're making and the instruments that other really high quality modern makers making, they're at a price point that people can actually afford. And I remember trying a bass recently, and I think the sticker was it was $130,000 or something like that. And I do not have $130,000 nor access to it at this moment. But among, I don't know what a better term is for it, but just sort of the high end modern makers, what's coming out is just really, it might, even if maybe you can't approach that hundreds of year old Italian wood. I mean, there's certain things you just can't go back in time and get that. But I mean, what's coming out now is just really amazing. And your bass, listening to your bass in Prague sounds great. And it's got that combination of, it's got that depth, it's got that broadness of tone, but it's got the clarity too. I mean, is that what you're going for in terms of tone? Do you have
That's my main goal, is to just sit there and be able to have enough spread with enough focus. And the focus is, it's hard because, you don't want to have a honky instrument, but you want to make sure that it's cutting and that it's getting to the back of the audience and that you can hear yourself. But you also want it to be full and rich sounding. And, this trend towards slightly smaller instruments, it makes everything more complex. You think of the wavelength of our subtones that we're playing, our low notes. I mean, the wavelength is longer than the top of the instrument. So you really have to find ways to compensate for the fact that, you're needing to reproduce notes that are actually all you're really getting information-wise from the string is, or I guess from the top. It's there in the string, but from the top, it's only recreating, it's sort of sussing all those out through the overtones, so you're able to hear that come through. But I feel like, arching I've just got this whole concept of, and I really think deeply about what's going on with the top. And I mean, the arch, it sort of projects the wavelengths out into the audience. I mean, yeah, there's just such a balance between everything, but I mean, it's the arching. That is what makes an instrument sound great. And then also the body shape too. I built four basses at once out of the same top wood and the same back and sides, 4 different models, same string length on every one of them. And this is another experiment of mine. This happened after ISB. I wanted to see what it would be like, and they were after, one was after a Montagnana bass, one was after a Galliano bass, one was after the Cerruti bass, and then one was after a Carcassi bass. And I went through, so your outline really dictates the tone of your instrument as well, and making an outline that is playable and has the right balance between playability and breadth there's so much complexity in that. I mean, picking your outline, it's not just they did know something more about proportions, because the better the maker was, the better the sound was. It was like the Cerruti and Montagnana models just sounded so much better than the Galliano and the Carcassi models. The Carcassi model is a great model. It's just as far as it's playable, and I feel like there was a little bit of loss. Now that being said, it's still a great sounding bass. It's a good sounding model, but there's this what I'm looking for personally in my own journey as a maker. I found more in those other two models. So I mean, it's hard to balance that too, because I've got orders for the Carcassi, and I don't want to bag that because it's a great bass, and I don't mean to sit there and talk poorly of it. It's a really good sounding bass, but I've compensated for that through the arching. It's complex. I don't mean to sound,
No. That's interesting. So but the arching plays that bigger role. Okay, that's cool. That and I love those two words that you use. It's like spread and focus. So those are like the two things you're going. Okay, I like knowing the terminology that people like to use. That's interesting, because I always think like depth or room fillingness or something like that. But spread and focus. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it's a hard balance to come across, and I really feel like getting to know your models well helps.
Yeah. Man, this is like the bass geekery that I like to get out there, and that I mean, is there, if someone's interested in ordering or getting on your list or however, maybe I want to make sure to get some contact info out there for you.
Well, I mean, you've mentioned mentioned in the interview, like I work with Robertson and Sons violins.
Yeah.
They're fantastic to me. I foresee myself being here in perpetuity. I mean, it's the opportunity of a lifetime. Anytime they need anything, they can come on out. They can contact me at the shop. They can contact me online. They can sit there. But, I think everybody in their bass life should make the pilgrimage out to the shop and just come see it. You don't need to be shopping seriously or anything like that. I'll give you a tour of the shop. I mean, I give tours all the time because, I'm talkative, and a lot of luthiers aren't talkative. I'm Mr. Blabbermouth. Hopefully I didn't say too much.
No. Well, I love, and I've had the pleasure of being at that shop a few times. And yeah, folks, if you haven't been there, it really is, you're driving down a kind of a regular kind of suburban feeling road, just like in Albuquerque. And then you pull over and it's like, you walk in and like, what is this place? Where have I and this recital hall is just, what a great idea. I'm not sure if other shops, I've never been to a shop that has them, but what a great idea in terms of trying to test out instruments and A/B things. I know that events go on there too, so it's very cool.
Yeah, it's one of those strange things. It's just like a bass or instrument mecca. Like it's just very, very cool. And everybody who works at the shop is a player. Like, the Barbara Barber she's a great violinist. Marie Robertson's a violinist. Don, professional cello player. Mike Brinegar was a professional cello player. Played in New Orleans for like 20 years. Went to Oberlin. I mean, it's everybody here is top notch. Player first, and and then everything else second. I mean, not everything else, but you understand.
Yeah. Yeah. Trevor, thank you so much. That was so much fun. Such a pleasure to talk to you. Folks, you can find out more about Trevor by visiting the Robertson's website. Just click on the About Us tab. And thank you so much for tuning in. It's such a thrill to spend time with you here. I hope that it's time well spent. I know that you could be doing a lot of things with your time, and I'm so thrilled. I appreciate it. I know Trevor appreciates it. And thank you so much. Please reach out. feedback@controversiesconversations.com. Send me an email. Let me know. Do you have a guest suggestion? Have you got an event coming up? Do you have a story to tell? Most of the people that I interview, in fact, you know what? Pretty much everybody that I've interviewed at this point is a guest recommendation. My my list is at about 400 right now, people I haven't spoken with. And we can always do a round two. I love doing round twos. I've got several round twos coming up. So lots of exciting things in store for the podcast. Hit me up on social media. You can find me. There are links on the Contrabass Conversations website. And thank you again, Daddario Strings, for sponsoring these podcasts. So great to have you on board. These are the kind of things that make this possible, that give me the opportunity to go out and go to events like Bass 2016 and go to other events that are coming up. ISB, I'm heading down to LA in a few days to interview several players down there, planning on doing more trips like that. And the only way I can do that is with the help of people like Daddario. So thank you, Daddario, for sponsoring the podcast. Check out links to them in the show notes. Check out Zyex Strings and stay tuned. Lots of great interviews coming up. I don't even know where to start. I've got a list of about 20 in the can to release. I've got another 20 scheduled. So we've got some really great things coming up here for the podcast. Thanks again. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.